this video, we're going to look at the scheduling features in NIM. The schedule allows you to assign users and resources to jobs and book them over periods of time. There are features that track the overall utilization versus their max capacity, as well as options to create your own rules for managing conflicts. Let's start by looking at the schedule navigation. The date range displays the current dates shown on the schedule. Clicking on the date range will bring up a mini calendar to allow you to navigate to a specific date. Clicking on the title bar will allow you to zoom out and broaden your view. Clicking the arrows for the previous and next buttons will actually bring you forward and back in the selected range. And clicking on the Today button will bring you to the current date. To the right, we have the option to set the current range of dates that we are viewing. By default, the schedule is loaded with a 1 month range. However, you can set it to 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or 1 year. We can also narrow the schedule down to 1 week, as well as a single day. Now, each of the job, users, and resource views have slightly different features available. When viewing the Jobs tab, hovering over a job will display a tooltip with some basic job information. Clicking on the ellipsis menu will bring up a list of some job-specific features, including adding all users who have events on the job to the crew, creating an event from the crew, going to the job start in the schedule, going to the job end in the schedule, and then loading the job directly. And we'll cover those more later in this video. Now, as you can see, the events are currently color-coded, and we can set the color coding by clicking on the color coding drop-down up here in the toolbar, and they're currently set to status colors. We can change that to location colors, as well as job colors. And this is available on each of the 3 tabs. In the center, we can zoom our view, so we actually widen out each of our dates. If I click all the way to the right here, I zoom way out and I can actually see more information on each of my days, or I can scale this back to actually see more days in my display. Additionally, we have the option to collapse each of the events to see more items vertically. By clicking on the collapse button, we actually condense each event down to a single row, and I can see more jobs in the list. Now, moving over to our users view, to the left, we have our list of users, and again, hovering over the user brings up some basic information about that user. We have the same navigation controls, same coloration options, but we have 2 additional features here. First is utilization. Currently, we're in the standard view where there's no utilization information present. If I click on utilization by hour, the days now become color-coded based on the overall utilization of the user. In this case, blue days are at or below capacity, and days that are orange are over capacity. The utilization of each event is set within the event details, and the max capacity for each user is set in the user's account. Viewing the overall daily utilization provides a quick view of which users are being booked beyond their capacity. Alternative options for viewing are also view by overall percentage. And here we can see instead of 8 of 8 hours, we're viewing 100% utilization. We'll cover configuring utilization and capacity values in a separate video. If I return to my standard view, it removes the daily color coding. We also have an option to view the overall utilization compared to the capacity. Right now, our max capacity is for all of the users in the schedule. However, we can narrow this down by using our filters. I have a pre-saved filter here, and I'm currently going to filter by all of my animators. In this case, I can see what my max capacity is during the weekdays. Our weekends are set to 0 capacity, and that's why here you can see our utilization is actually going over our max capacity. This chart provides a quick understanding of how well you're utilizing your resources and your personnel. Now, looking at resources, again, we can see that hovering over the resource provides a tooltip with some basic information about the resource, and I can see that I have a lot of events for my Houdini license. Now, each of these color codings are currently based off of status, and I can see that all of my green items are booked. And if I want to consolidate that, again, I can do this with a filter. And in this case, I'm going to create a new filter. So I'm going to open up our new filter panel. Under status, I'm going to select all of my booked items and click filter. Now I'm only looking at my booked events for those licenses. And again, I could do something similar where I view the overall utilization. I can see here that I have 5 licenses available, and I can see that each event is using 1 license. So in this case, I have 1 license used on these first 2 days, 2 licenses on these other 3 days, and up to 3 licenses over here. And again, I can do something similar with our utilization chart. Now, if I want to isolate this down to just our Houdini licenses, I can also add an additional filter to just filter down our Houdini licenses. And now I'm looking at my Houdini license capacity. Now, one interesting thing about tracking capacity is that capacity is actually set on a dated basis. So for items like licenses, when we know they're going to expire, I can move ahead to the future here, and I can actually see that my overall capacity for my license is going to reach 0. So at this point in time, I know I can no longer book any licenses after this point until I actually have my license renewed. Now let's go ahead and look at creating new events. I'm going to go back over to my Jobs tab, and I'm going to move forward in time. One thing to note is you can actually see where the job starts and stops within the schedule. Currently, the lighter cells are the ones that are within the job start and end date, and the darker cells are outside of the job's parameters. So for example, I can jump to the job start date and see the beginning of the job is right over here, or I can go to the end of the job and see where this job ends. Now let's look at creating a new event. We have the option to create events multiple ways. First, we can use the Add Event button up here in the toolbar. By clicking on that, it brings up our event panel. In the event panel, we have the option to set the title, description, our status, location, job, as well as any users or resources assigned to the event. Now we can assign multiple users or resources to this event. However, we'll look at that in a second example. I have the option to set the duration. Now, when I create an event from the Add Event button, it automatically sets the event's start and end date to the current day, and it is marked as an all-day event. All-day events operate outside of time zones so that they are locked to particular dates. I can turn off all-day event, and now I can see that my time zones have appeared, and I can set a particular start and end time as well. If I select my time zone button, I can choose individual start and end time zones, but I can also turn off use separate start and end time zones and use a single different time zone for this event. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave all day event selected. We additionally have options to repeat the event, never, daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly, and we'll look at those in another example. Lastly, we have our utilization tab. Here we can set utilization values for the event for our users as well as our resources. In this case, our user utilization is set to 8 hours per day, and our options are hours per day, percent per day, and percent per day is actually calculated as a percentage of the user's max capacity, as well as total hours for the event over the duration of the event. We also have resource utilization, where it's calculated in units per day, or additionally percent per day, as a calculation of the number of units per the resource's max capacity. When I save this, it's going to go ahead and create my event here on the timeline on the current day. Now I can drag this out by grabbing an edge to extend it out. I can also move it to another place in time. And again, I can shorten that down to just be 1 week. Now the other option to create an event is to double click inside of any dated cell. So if I wanted to start an event on the 5th here, I can double click there and I get my same information. And in this case, I'll put this one as a first hold. We'll add some basic information here. We'll add another user as well as a resource. And what I want to do here is set my date range to last over 5 days. And I'm going to set this one as a repeating event to repeat weekly. In this case, it's going to repeat every week on a Monday, and I'm going to set the number of occurrences to 3. So when I hit save, I now have this event for all 3 occurrences. Now, when I move these or edit these events, they will all be moved in unison. So if I want to drag this to another job, I can bring this down, And I am asked, do I want to edit just this occurrence or edit the entire series? In this case, I want to edit the series. If I edit just the occurrence, it will actually detach that event from the rest of the series and allowing you to modify that one independently. For example, I can grab the end date of this last event here and just modify this individual event occurrence. Now you can see we have our repeating symbol up here indicating that these are part of a series. This one has a repeat symbol with a slash in it, meaning it was part of a series that has been removed. If I want to reset the series, I can double click on the event, choose edit the series, and I have an option to reset the series. Resetting the series will actually bring back my original event structure with the original repeat rules. Now, in addition to using the add button or double clicking in a cell, we can bring out our events panel by clicking on our events panel button here. And now I have a list of users, user groups, resources, as well as resource groups, and something called bundles that we'll look at in a second. Now I can take any one of these and drag them onto a job and drag out that event. Now I have an event for that user. Additionally, I can drag resources onto that event to stack up these resources that are being used. So in this case, if I want to add a workstation and a Houdini license and a Maya license, I can do so. Clicking on the event brings up a tooltip where I can see what are the items associated with that event. If I right-click on an event, a context menu appears. The options in the context menu will vary depending upon the view. First, we can choose a status. So let's say I wanted to put this as a second hold. I can go ahead and do that immediately. I can also open the edit panel directly from the context menu, choose to copy the event, delete the event, or open the job that this event is in reference to. Now, we dragged over individual users as well as resources, but let's say I drag over an entire department to a job. So if I grab the animators user group and I add that to this job, I can now see that 9 users that were part of this group have all been automatically applied to this single event. Now they can be moved and distributed all at once, working within a single event. And when we go over to the users tab, we're going to look at some options there as well on how to individually manage those users. Now let's jump over to bundles. Bundles are a way to create a preset number of users, user groups, resources, or resource groups onto a single item. So in this case, I have a user as well as a number of resources. And by creating that bundle and dragging that onto a timeline, I now automatically create a preset event for that user and those resources. So if you have a number of users that are always using the same workstation or licenses, you can just go ahead and save those as existing bundles and just drag those onto jobs as needed. Now I can also drag this onto other jobs and overlap and stack those. And you'll see when we go over to the users tab, you'll see how these events actually stack up. So in this case, I'll put this one as a second hold and I will set this one as a first hold. And just so we can see it, I'm going to set this one as available. Now let's move over to our users tab and see how creating these events influenced our users and resources. So here are our events. We had some individual daily events here, but if we actually look down, here's that event for all 9 users that we dragged over for our animation group. If I open that event, I can see that all 9 of my users are in there. And if I move this, let's actually consolidate our view so we can see this a little better. So if I actually shorten this event, I can see that this event actually all moves together. So in essence, we're actually looking at multiple representations of the same event. Now, I do have the option to make this event unique. So let's say this person needs to be modified independently of the group. If I choose the Make Unique option from the context menu, we'll go ahead and click OK to make that a separate event. And now you can see this event only has 8 users and they've been removed and I can modify them independently as needed. So it's a great way to actually start with a group and then reduce the number of users and modify them if you need to create some separation. But you'll see here now that if I move my original group, this event isn't going to go with it. It is an independent event now. Now in this case, we have our 8 users here. I'm going to go ahead and add a Houdini license to this event. Now again, that resource gets added to all of these events. And if I come over to our resources tab, I can now see I have a single representation for 8 users here. And just as it was when I was moving those users around, if I modify this event and slip this over to end on the 23rd, when I go back to my users tab, I'll see that those events have been modified all at once. Now, working with the events panel to drag over users, resources, and bundles is a really fast way to work up a schedule, but we also have additional options. So when you're in the job tab, I'm going to go ahead and expand this here. We do have some additional features which allow us to add users to the crew. So for example, I can take all users who have events of a particular status and I can choose which one. So for example, let's say I want to add it to all users that are booked and also ones that have a first hold. I'm going to go ahead and add them to the crew. So they were just added to the crew of the job. Conversely, I can also create an event from any existing crew. So if the crew is already applied to the job, I can create an event from the crew. Here's all the people that are on the crew of this job. Let's say that they're booked, and it is going to set the start and end date for the event to the start and end of that job. So I can go ahead and hit save. And that did provide me with a conflict. And we'll go ahead and look at conflicts next now that that just showed up. But here, now I have a single event for all of those users. Going over to my users tab, I can see that event here and I can see how they're all actually booked currently on both of those jobs because we dragged over the same users. Now let's look at those conflicts as they just appeared. Now we can see we have an existing conflict here, and we'll look at that one in a second, but let's look at creating some events and seeing what those conflict creations look like. So if I create a new event here for this license, and I'll go ahead and drag this out, I'm going to set the status to second hold so we can see it. And now if I create another event, I'll adjust the status so we can see the color. Now I currently have a conflict rule that says that I can't have more than one Houdini license at any one time. So if I drag this over and I overlap these two, I'm going to get an alert that there's a conflict between those two events. And when I do, those events actually become highlighted. We also get an indicator up here at the top that a couple of conflicts exist. Now our first option is to click our conflict alert, and that will open up our conflicts panel, or we can simply open it from our events panel button. Now here we can see we have a couple of conflicts, and so we want to determine which conflict this is. And we have 2 ways to do this. First, I can click on a conflict, and that will take me to that location of that conflict. Now when I click on this, you can see it dims the other events in the view, and it also highlights the date that the conflict exists on. So I can go ahead and move that over, removing my conflict, and that conflict has now been resolved and removed from our view. Now let's say we were in this view and we had multiple conflicts that existed here. Let's go ahead and create our conflict state again. So now that we're in our conflict state, I don't know which of these conflicts is which. So what I can do is I can actually click on this because there's no other events here in this view. I don't see anything that is particularly conflicting with us. I don't know what is actually causing this conflict. So I can right click on that event and choose identify conflicts. Now, when I do so, I can see the date that the conflict is happening on, and I can see the rule that the conflict exists for. However, I can see in this case, the conflict rule is a people rule, and that's the name of my conflict, and that what's causing the conflict is the user. So something with this user is actually in conflict. Now, if I click on this conflict button, it will actually take me to that user and to the date that that conflict exists. And I can see here, I actually do have a second event directly on that user where there's a conflict. And in this case, I can slide that over and resolve that conflict so it is no longer an issue. Now, if I want to go back to resolving this original conflict, this conflict was in our resource view and wasn't tied to any events in our user view. Clicking on this will show a pop-up saying the selected conflict isn't visible from within this tab. Would you like to navigate to the selected conflict? We'll go ahead and click OK. That'll take us over to the resource tab and slide us over to the location of the conflict. And again, I can adjust my events accordingly to resolve my conflict. Now, one thing to note is that you see a time zone here. Conflicts are all time zone centric. Because all-day events are actually date-centric and are not tied to a time zone, any conflict you're going to see for an event that is an all-day event versus a timed event will be relative to your current time zone. Now, to get back some real estate on my schedule, if I want to close my events panel, I can click my button again and the event panel will close for us. Now, we did briefly look at filtering. However, there are a couple more options that we can look at. First, we have this search option here, and I can search for particular items. So for example, I can search by resource name and it'll limit my list of items here. I can clear that out. But then I can bring up my filter panel. Within the filter panel, there are going to be unique options within different views. Within the schedule, we can filter by particular jobs, locations, as well as statuses. Now, this is going to filter out events of a particular status. So if I wanted to filter all of my first holds, I can go ahead and choose filter. And now I'm only looking at my first hold events. I can go ahead and clear that. Now we can also build up more complex filtering by adding items to the filter panel below. So in this case, I can look for everything that it has a location of, say, Los Angeles, and then I can add another row and look for any items in the resource group equal to licenses. And if I go ahead and filter that, I now have a subset of items that are included in that. And you can use these in conjunction with the events filter. So for example, for my resource filter, I've limited those 2 resources. But then if I also want to put a status filter on my events, I can now see just those events within those filtered resources that exist in this location. Within the filter panel, I can also save this. So I can save this as a new name. So I can say this is like LA licenses and hit save. And now that filter is applied to our dropdown here. I can go back to my all items, but I can also, again, choose that for the future. Now, these filters are available to not only be saved, but you can share these with other users and user groups. The creation of filters and more complex filter structures will be covered in a separate video. And that is an overall highlight of the features working with the schedule in NIM. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to support@nim-labs.com. Thank you.